Hello everyone, this is our first edition of the YouTube book club and we are going to be reading Come See the Fair by Gabriel Savit. This book is about a girl who travels to the Chicago World's Fair in the late 1800s and she pretends to be a psychic. But the author's note says, this book is for anyone who has ever been burned. So I think that our main character is not going to get what she's expecting. Chapter 1, Strange Fire. And the first picture looks like this. It looks like a flyer. It says, Mrs. Jenny Blodgett presents the amazing little Ava Root, clairvoyant, spirit medium, channeler of the voices of the dead. Her uncanny abilities shock the senses. She brings forth messages from the departed. Come and see, come and see, come and see. During the first week of June 1893, these handbills were unavoidable in the village of Nadab, Ohio. Mailed ahead, they were as common as coal dust by the time Miss Blodgett and little Ava arrived. Piled by the door at the Hoffman Emporium, boot-trodden and filthy on the floor of Wilson's saloon, and wherever Mrs. Blodgett encountered them, she bent to add the following lines. Wednesday at 8 p.m., back room at Wilson's, 35 cents, just like magic. It began, as everything does, with a spark. Mrs. Blodgett had started drinking early that day, and her hand shook as she struck the matchbox. 2 times, 3. A puckered woman on the front bench was fanning herself against the summer heat, and Mrs. Blodgett had to turn her back to the audience for shelter from the breeze. With a final strike, the match had burst into flame. Glaring over her shoulder, Mrs. Blodgett lit the candle. The presence of this candle, like so many of the evening, was theatrical. It allowed little Ava to begin the performance by lifting the light out of the room like a grand curtain. And seances were always better in the dark. The truth was that Ava Root had not been particularly little for quite some time. Years before, when Mrs. Blodgett had first trotted her out, the description really had been apt. A tiny 7-year-old, wide-eyed, rosy-cheeked. But she was nearly twice as old now, and the passing days had stretched and sharpened her like the fires of a forge. Every day a new town. Every night a new bed, and in between, train car after train car after train car. By the time they found themselves in Nadab, they'd given up well over 1,000 seances in the towns that had butted up from the steel bows of the railroad. Carthage, Kansas, Finisterre, Ohio, Goshen, Nebraska. And though she no longer had the smokescreen of innocence to hide behind, Ava had learned all she needed to know about passing on the communications of the dead. Which, of course, wasn't possible. But all the same, she had a way of making it look as if it were not. From the back of the room, Ava considered Nadab's paltry crowd. Not counting herself or Mrs. Blodgett, there were 5 of them there. More that had been in the smallest seance she had ever given, but not by much. They were mostly old, too, which muddied things. The more one lives, the more one loses. She took a deep breath. It wasn't her favorite trick, but there was always the war to rely on. Practically everyone over 40 had lost someone who'd served in blue or gray. Cannon fire, gun smoke, the Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! It was going to be that kind of night. She flexed her fingers. Someone in the slack, sweating audience let out a little fart, and this seemed to deplete Miss Blodgett's already scarce reserves of patience. Fine, she said. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to present to you Miss Ava Root, the young innocent touched with the power to channel the voices of the dead. Kindly give her your attention, and in return she will show you things you never thought possible. This speech had once been considerably longer and considerably better, but then Mrs. Blodgett had once cared. Ava? 5 heads swiveled back to stare at her. She stumbled forward. There, she said, blinking at the chair that had clearly been set up for her. This performance of uncertainty generally made a better impression when Miss Blodgett responded in some way, but she'd already begun to wobble gently around the room, snuffing out the gas lamps. Swallowing, Ava slid into her seat. Soon, only the flickering candlelight was left. "It works better in the dark," she whispered. "Can I?" And she gestured to the candle. Her eyes passed slowly over the faces before her. This was the most important part of the evening, this moment of anticipation. She could make all the right guesses, say just the right things, and still, if these people didn't want her to do impossible things for them, then she simply couldn't. The lady in the front bench gave a curt nod, engaged but not terribly enthusiastic. 3 rows behind her, though, there was a man with an unkempt beard who smiled kindly at her. That was good, a foothold. Ava pressed her eyes shut, leaned forward, and blew. The candle guttered and died. Darkness. Now she began to thicken her breathing with effort. "I hear thunder," she said, "men yelling. There's smoke, fire." She went quiet for a moment. "Is it a storm?" Somewhere in the room a chair creaked. "But there's no rain," she said. "No, not a storm." Another little pause. "Is it thunder or—" "Cannon," said an eager woman in the 3rd row. "It's a cannon." Ava turned her head immediately. "Yes." "Was he afraid?" asked the eager woman. To be sure, it would have been kinder to say that whoever this woman was thinking of had died without suffering. But that would have made rather a duller seance. And besides, the more you agreed with them, Ava found, the more people began to believe what you were saying. She nodded, sadly. There was quite a lot of fear, but gratitude, too. He wants you to know that he thought of you before the end. "Me?" said the eager woman. Ava chuckled. "He knew you'd be surprised." "Oh," said the woman fondly. Ava didn't know who they were talking about, of course, but it didn't matter. The woman in front of her did, and her certainty filled in Ava's sketchy outline with a memory so clear that it seemed to breathe. That's how this worked. Ava spent a fair amount of time on the eager woman. She was well disposed to believe, and Ava had a tendency to make her guesses work, even when they were a bit wide in their aim. By the time Ava moved on, the woman was sniffling softly. A job well done. The lady in the front row came next. She was the sort who wanted to be won over. A little reserved, a little skeptical, but Ava, as always, was patient, and mere minutes later, she was forgiving the lady for her unkindness to a niece who, Ava was almost certain, had fallen to her death in a well. And then, in a flash, everything changed. Ava had just turned to engage the man with the unkempt beard when, with a spark and a sputter, the dead candle at her elbow burst into life. She made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a yell, and was on her feet before she knew it. "What is it?" said the woman in the front row. The candle was burning bright now, its flame tall and unwavering. Ava wasn't sure what to do. Nothing like this had ever happened before. "Someone," she said, improvising madly. "Someone is here with us." And this was truer than she knew at the time. "Who?" said the woman in the front row. "Who is it?" Ava turned her eyes back to the audience. The candle flame gave a wobble, sending inky shadows vaulting across all the expectant faces. She still had a performance to give. "That," said Ava, "is a question for you." The bearded man frowned. "Me?" "Yes. Who is it?" The bearded man took a deep breath and began to speak. Ava barely heard him for the voices in her head. "Come to the fair!" The voice in her head had spoken so loudly that the words of the bearded man had been entirely blotted out. What? "Why, I said my daddy always, 'Come see the fair.'" Ava gasped. Nearly half her life, Ava had pretended to hear messages that weren't there. Now, all of a sudden, her mind was filled to bursting with an impossible voice. At the back of the room, Mrs. Blodgett shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. Ava stammered. Who? And as if in answer, a rush of sound nearer to her than anything had ever been before overcame her. The tinkle and bray of the band organ, the laughter and chat of a crowd, and again the impossible voice, loud and commanding and clear. Come see the fair. I don't understand, said Ava. The room was suddenly silent. It was only a moment before Mrs. Blodgett swept forward, her face twisted with anger. I'm afraid, she said, that little Miss Ava is tired and has to withdraw. There was a hubbub of protestation, but Mrs. Blodgett's voice cut through it sharply. Thank you, she said. Thank you. Good night now. And taking Ava roughly by the arm, she seized the candle, blew it out, and marched swiftly out of the room. When she first met Mrs. Blodgett, Ava Root was living in an establishment in Fletcher's Gulch, Indiana, called Miss Augusta Grandage's Home for Unwanted and Destitute Girls. She had no memory of anything before that place. The handlers at Grandage's seemed to see themselves rather more as salespeople than caretakers. Anything that bred attachment was strenuously discouraged, and the penalties for talking out of turn were severe. But there were many worse institutions to be in. No one was violent or neglectful. Adoptions were frequent. Miss Augusta was rigorous, but generally benevolent. When Miss Blodgett arrived that day, she asked the girls to be shown to her in a private room, one by one. Most of them were dismissed without a word, but those deemed promising enough to address were offered a single question. Do you remember me? Mrs. Blodgett had, of course, never visited Fletcher's Gulch. It would have been impossible then for any of the girls to say yes, truthfully. Nevertheless, everyone who said no was immediately dismissed. Ava happened to be one of the last shown into the room that day, and whispered word of what was going on there made its way back to her. When Mrs. Blodgett asked her question, Ava was prepared. Oh, yes, she said. Of course I remember you. Mrs. Blodgett's eyes narrowed, and taking sudden inspiration from a painting on a wall, Ava spouted an idyllic story about a picnic in a town square. It was a complete fabrication, and they both knew it. And this was precisely what Mrs. Blodgett had been waiting for. Someone to convince her of the impossible. The expectations were never directly articulated. Instead, Mrs. Blodgett had taken Ava to observe séance after séance, night after night, in town after town, and sometimes at the facilitation of the very same medium. Slowly, the tricks of the trade became clear. How to sow confidence, how to make the general feel specific, how to leave room for people to fill in their own details, and an audience began to seem to Ava like a craggy rock face. Here a handhold, there a ledge to grab onto. And then one night, leaving a little theater somewhere in Pennsylvania, Mrs. Blodgett had spoken. He was very good, wasn't he? The medium? The medium in question had been an old man with a gigantic sideburns, and he'd been far too prone to making real, specific guesses. No, said Ava, no, he wasn't good at all. You'll do better, said Mrs. Blodgett. The next night, Ava gave her first séance. She, it turned out, had something of a talent, and the people crowded around, wanting, needing, begging her for impossible answers. They were so grateful. Soon, Ava felt quite fond of her audiences. But a structure built on a lie can only stand for so long. Ava's fondness began to rot into resentment, and then disdain, and before she knew it, her disdain had become a dull, tarnished pity. It was the need that made her so sad, the constant need for something that simply wasn't there. And if her audience went home with the impression that they'd gotten what they paid for, she knew it couldn't last. In the morning, they'd wake up again as lonesome and grief-stricken as they ever had been. She was sure of it. It happened to her. Because the need that the people brought to lay at her feet every night was the very same need that Ava carried from town to town, village to village, séance to séance. The need for things to be different, better, or brighter than they were. And this was why, as Mrs. Blodgett tore her from the saloon in Nadab, Ohio, Ava caught the strange feeling blossoming in her chest. Strange and deeply concerning. It was hope. Ava sat in silence, her shoulders high and tight, as if she were waiting to be hit. No one in the audience at Wilson's had been happy with the early ending of the seance, but Mrs. Blodgett had already arranged for a local drayman to cart them to their accommodations in the next town, and thankfully they were able to leave before anyone asked for their money back. That was the greatest calamity that Mrs. Blodgett could imagine, paying refunds. Crickets, hoofbeats, the creak of a cart. It was only once the lights of Nadab were far behind that Mrs. Blodgett took the candle from her bag. Ava braced herself. Mrs. Blodgett didn't so much have a temper generally as the temper had Mrs. Blodgett. "How did you do it?" she asked. "I didn't," Ava insisted. I didn't. Mrs. Blodgett narrowed her eyes. "Don't lie to me, girl." "I didn't," Ava insisted. "Did you?" "Don't be foolish," said Mrs. Blodgett. Ava leaned in to get a better look. "Is there anything?" Mrs. Blodgett shoved her away. "No," she said, "it's just an ordinary candle," and she tossed it roughly into her bag. The drayman's lantern swung gently with the gait of his horse. "Would you care," said Mrs. Blodgett, "to explain that disgraceful display, gasping and flopping around like a fish?" "I was thrown." Mrs. Blodgett shook her head. "You're never thrown. What happened?" Ava took a breath. What could she tell her? What could she say? Usually, Ava and Mrs. Blodgett ate their supper together after the seance. Tonight, though, Mrs. Blodgett ushered her into their little hotel room without so much as a crust of bread and stood there in the doorway, hands on her hips, just waiting for her to object. Ava stayed quiet. She had no interest in worsening the situation, but her silence only seemed to make Mrs. Blodgett angrier. "I think," she snipped, "that you ought to sleep on the floor tonight." In general, where there was only one bed, Ava and Mrs. Blodgett shared. This was no particular pleasure, but it was certainly more tempting than the rough wooden floor. Yes," said Mrs. Blodgett, "sleep on the floor." The door slammed shut. Ava could hear Mrs. Blodgett turning the key. With a sigh, she took the stained pillow from the bed and set about trying to make herself comfortable. But even when she laid her body down, Ava couldn't seem to bring her mind to rest. How had the candle relit itself? Whose voice had spoken in her mind? And what fare? For hours, Ava's grumbling stomach traded choruses with the questions in her mind, and she tossed and turned and tossed again. She only realized that she began to doze when she was woken by the sound of Miss Blodgett outside, stumbling drunk, cursing, trying 5 or 6 times to fit her key into the lock. Once the woman was inside, Ava heard her rifling through her carpet bag, counting, crinkling cash, and Mrs. Blodgett's footsteps paused as she caught sight of Ava on the floor. Hunk! She hocked up a clod of something and then swallowed it back down. Idiot child. And ricocheting from wall to wall, she made her way back out of the room. Ava opened her eyes. Mrs. Blodgett had left the door ajar. A handful of crumpled bills littered the floor. The hallway outside was empty, but nonetheless, Ava crept towards the head of the staircase as softly as she could. "That enough?" Mrs. Blodgett's voice, slurring, over loud, rang out from below. Instinctively, Ava pressed herself against the wall. There was a shushing, papering sound. The cash. A heavy male voice spoke. "This is much less than you said." "Don't you worry," said Mrs. Blodgett. "Hold up your end of the bargain and there'll be more. Much more." The man sighed. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, then. Front of the train station? "Oh, I'll be there," said Mrs. Blodgett. "And what about your girl?" "What about her?" "She won't come looking for you, will she?" said Mrs. Blodgett. "That idiot child's never done a single thing without my help." "And what will you tell her?" "Tell her? Nothing." Now there was a tight little pause. "Don't you look at me like that," said Mrs. Blodgett. "Do you keep a horse that can't pull a plow? Do you keep a cow that stops giving milk? I've got my own life to live." "Of course," said the man. He didn't sound convinced, though. "You just keep your end of the deal," said Mrs. Blodgett, "and there'll be twice that much for you when we get to San Francisco." The sky above was strewn with stars. The waters whisper at the prow of Ava's boat. Lights. There were lights in the darkness. Great white buildings, towers, domes, an unending forest of columns and archways. Thick flocks, crowds of people, their eyes turned to heaven. A screech, a bang, colored light drenching the shoulders of the white city. There was fire in the sky. She passed beneath a bridge into a wide basin wreathed with palaces and temples. In the distance, a colossal statue rose in the golden robes, her head crowned in laurel. Ava could feel her gaze. Another explosive barrage, fireworks above. "Come see the fair!" She leaned forward to see who had spoken, and with a lurch, Ava tumbled out of her boat. She was just about to plunge into the water when she woke. Light gray morning skulked outside the hotel room window. Ava was still on the floor. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Blodgett intended to abandon her. Ava had meant to stay awake, to remain vigilant so that Mrs. Blodgett couldn't sneak off into the darkness, but there seemed little danger of that now. There she was, still dressed, atop the bed sheets, snoring aggressively. Slowly, Ava rose. It was now, she supposed, or never. And so she shouldered the bag that held her meager assortment of belongings, and moving as quietly as she could, Ava crossed the floor to Mrs. Blodgett's carpet bag and pulled the handles apart. There was, at the very top of the jumble, a thick wad of cash. Ava took a soft, shallow breath. In all their years together, Mrs. Blodgett had never, not once, given her so much as a red cent. Ava had earned that money, and now she's going to need it. She was just about to close the bag up again when the last night's impossible candle came peeking out of a snarl in the dirty clothes, its scorched wick coiled like a question mark. The cash felt oddly light, insubstantial between the fingers of her left hand. The candle felt just as heavy and solid in her right. Mrs. Blodgett snorted and rolled over. Ava's heart surged, and she was out the door before she even realized it. That was it. She had done it. She left. The thrill in Ava's heart only grew as she made her way down the wooden sidewalk slats. The sun was rising, and everywhere people were beginning their daily rituals. Opening the doors, stoking fires, carefully arranging their wares. Everyone seemed to be bounded in, cornered by the day ahead of them. But not Ava. There was a train waiting when she got to the station, and a pleasant sense of industry. Conductors pacing the platform, porters lifting luggage, men and women taking their leave. Only one of the ticketing windows was open at this early hour, and Ava joined the short line, daydreaming idly of where she might like to go. She hadn't seen much of the East, and she spent almost no time in cities. Boston, maybe? New York? Ava was next in line when the sun erupted over the roof of the neighboring tavern. Warm light flooded her face, and she smiled, raising her hand to shade her eyes. Immediately, her gut gave a sickening lurch. There, coming around the corner, bedraggled and furious, was Mrs. Blodgett, clutching her carpet bag in her hand. "Next, please," sang the ticket agent, and Ava hurried to the window. "I need a ticket," she said frantically. Mrs. Blodgett had turned towards the train station. "Very well," said the ticket agent. "Where to?" "All aboard!" "Where's that train headed?" she said, pointing at the platform. "Well," said the agent, "to Chicago, but good, that's where I'm headed." Mrs. Blodgett was only a half a block away now. She'd broken into a run. "Are you?" The agent meant to say sure, but she cut him off. "Yes." Ava tossed far too much money into the counter. That man's eyes widened. "All aboard!" "It's yours," she said, "if I'm on that train before it leaves." The ticket agent bent swiftly to his work. Mrs. Blodgett would be there in less than a minute. "Please hurry," Ava whispered, and just as the station door swung open, the agent held out her ticket. When it was all said and done, Ava would look back on much of what happened with a heavy heart. Unsure where the sweetness ended and the bitterness began, but one memory never failed to bring a smile to her face. Mrs. Blodgett on the platform, red-faced and ranting, as Ava slid safely on the train. It was almost like magic. Okay, so this is really interesting and good so far. I like it. She is going to Chicago, and a voice in her head is telling her to go see the fair. If you know anything about history, you know that the Chicago World's Fair is happening at that time. So some voice is calling her to the Chicago World's Fair, and she doesn't even know it yet. And all these circumstances are aligning to get her there. So I'm really excited. Thank you for joining me in our book nook, and I can't wait to read to you next week. Thank you. Bye. Oh, and if you want to follow around, you can get a copy of the book at the Children's Desk.